All right, let's dive in. Today we're talking about something that's been generating a lot of buzz, long COVID in kids.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that's raising a lot of questions and honestly some concerns too.
Exactly. And there's so much information and misinformation out there, it can be hard to know what to believe. So that's why we're here today. We're going to be taking a deep dive into a couple of really interesting pieces. We've got an opinion piece from Blake Murdoch in Scientific American.
Oh yeah, I read that one. It was pretty thought-provoking.
It was. And we've also got a piece from the New York Times by Emily Baumgartner that takes a look back at the days before vaccines for diseases that were, well, pretty terrifying.
It's amazing how much we take for granted these days when it comes to preventable diseases, right?
It really is. And Murdoch's piece, he kind of jumps right in with a pretty strong argument. He says that downplaying COVID's impact on kids, saying it's no big deal, is actually pretty dangerous.
And I think his point is that we're just starting to understand the long-term effects of COVID, especially this thing called long COVID.
Right, those lingering symptoms that can stick around long after the initial infection. And what's really concerning is that some research suggests that 10 to 20% of kids who get COVID could end up dealing with these long-term effects.
Yeah, that's a significant number of kids.
Yeah.
Murdoch even mentions that this could mean as many as 5.8 million kids in the U.S. alone might be affected.
Wow, that's a staggering number. It really highlights the importance of taking this seriously. And it kind of ties into that whole the cure is worse than the disease argument that's been going around, blaming things like school closures for the challenges some kids are facing today.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and Murdoch acknowledges that the disruptions caused by the pandemic definitely had an impact on kids. But he argues that blaming everything on those measures is a bit of an oversimplification.
Right, like we're missing part of the picture. He even calls out a specific study that got a lot of attention, the one that claimed to link lockdowns with accelerated cortical thinning in kids' brains.
Ah, yes, that study.
Yeah.
Well, Murdoch points out some flaws in that research.
Yeah, like the fact that they didn't account for other factors like, oh, I don't know, the massive increase in COVID infections that was happening at the same time.
Exactly. They basically said that because these two things happened around the same time, one must have caused the other. But that's not how science works.
It's like saying ice cream causes hot weather just because people eat more ice cream when it's hot out.
Uh-huh, exactly. There could be a million other reasons. And in this case, the impact of the virus itself seems like a pretty big factor to overlook.
Okay, so maybe that study wasn't so great, but what about the actual impact of COVID on kids' brains? If we know it can cause changes in adults, is it crazy to think it might be affecting kids too, especially with this cortical thinning thing?
That's a really good question, and it's something that researchers are still trying to fully understand. To put it simply, the cortex is that outer layer of the brain, the wrinkly part. It's where a lot of the higher level thinking happens, memory, attention, language, all that good stuff.
So are we talking about those wrinkles smoothing out?
Yeah, kind of. Some thinning of the cortex is a normal part of aging, but this study seemed to suggest it might be happening faster in kids who experienced lockdowns. The problem is, without properly accounting for other factors, it's impossible to say for sure what's causing these changes.
So it's still a bit of a mystery.
It is. But even though we're still figuring out the brain stuff, we do know a bit more about how long COVID is actually showing up in kids. Murdoch mentions a study in JAMA that looked at the different symptoms.
Right, and it seems like the symptoms can vary depending on the kid's age.
Yeah, for younger kids, between 6 and 11, the most common complaints seem to be memory and focus issues, along with a bunch of aches and pains, back pain, neck pain, stomach aches, headaches, that sort of thing.
Oh, wow, I can't even imagine trying to focus in school with all that going on.
Right, it can really impact their ability to learn and just enjoy being a kid. And for teenagers, those between 12 and 17, it seems like they're more likely to have changes in their sense of smell or taste, along with fatigue and those same body aches.
So it's definitely not just a simple cold.
No, it's not. And it's important to remember that these symptoms aren't just in their heads. They're tied to real physiological changes that are happening in the body.
Like actual damage to different organ systems.
Exactly. We're talking about the cardiovascular system, the neurological system, even the immune system.
So heart, brain, immune system, all potentially affected by this virus. And it's not just short-term damage either. There's even some early evidence suggesting that COVID infection in childhood could increase the risk of developing diabetes later in life.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on as research continues, and it really underscores the need to shift our focus from just treating the acute infection to understanding and addressing these potential long-term consequences.
Which brings us to a really interesting point. How can we use what we've learned from the past to navigate this new challenge? That's where Emily Baumgartner's article in the New York Times comes in. It's a fascinating look back at the history of 6 diseases that were once major threats to children: measles, diphtheria, tetanus, mumps, rubella, and polio.
Diseases that, thankfully, most of us today only know about from history books, thanks to the power of vaccines.
It's easy to forget, living in a world with modern medicine, just how devastating those illnesses were.
Absolutely. They weren't just like a little cold or flu. These diseases could be life-altering and sometimes even fatal. Take measles, for example. Before the vaccine was introduced in 1963, pretty much every kid got it by the time they were 15.
And it wasn't just a rash and a fever. Tens of thousands of kids were hospitalized each year, and hundreds died.
Baumgartner really paints a vivid picture of these diseases, how they spread, how severe the symptoms could be, the impact they had on entire families and communities.
It's hard to imagine that level of fear and uncertainty surrounding childhood illnesses today, knowing that we have vaccines to prevent them.
It really is. And speaking of fear and uncertainty, there was another disease that terrified parents for decades: polio.
I've seen those pictures of kids in iron lungs struggling to breathe. It's heartbreaking.
It was a truly devastating disease. In the early 1950s, there were over 21,000 cases of polio in the U.S. each year.
And then the vaccine came along. By 1993, that number had dropped to just 1. That's unbelievable.
It really shows the power of vaccines and how they've completely changed the course of history.
So as we grapple with this new challenge of long COVID in children, it seems like there's a lot we can learn from these past experiences.
Absolutely. The fear and uncertainty surrounding polio back then, it's not that different from what we're seeing with long COVID today. And just like we learned to fight polio, we can use the tools we have, like vaccination, to protect kids from long COVID.
And Murdoch outlines several steps we can take to reduce the risk of long COVID in kids. He starts with promoting seasonal vaccination to help prevent infection in the first place.
It's about building a wall of protection for both individuals and the community as a whole.
Right. And he also talks about the need for policies that support families, like paid sick leave, so parents don't have to choose between their job and keeping their sick kid home from school.
That's so important. We need to make it easier for families to prioritize health without worrying about financial consequences.
Exactly. He even suggests ending the practice of funding schools based solely on attendance, which can sometimes encourage schools to prioritize full classrooms over the health of their students.
It's about shifting the focus from attendance to well-being. And Murdoch also makes a strong case for normalizing the use of masks, especially those high-filtration respirator masks.
He sees it as a simple and effective way to protect ourselves and others, especially in those crowded indoor spaces.
Like wearing a seatbelt in a car. It's just a basic safety measure that can make a big difference.
And he goes even further, suggesting we need to rethink indoor air quality standards, particularly in schools. He compares it to food safety standards in restaurants. We wouldn't tolerate unsanitary conditions where food is prepared, so why should we accept poor air quality where kids spend so much of their time?
It's a great analogy. And it highlights the need to prioritize children's health in all aspects of our society. Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
You know, in Murdoch's piece, he mentions that long COVID symptoms aren't just physical. He says there's growing evidence that these long-term effects can also impact kids' mental health.
Right, that's a crucial point. It's like our physical and mental health, they're so connected.
Totally.
And the JAMA study that Murdoch cites, it actually found that kids who were dealing with long COVID symptoms also had higher levels of anxiety and depression.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly struggling with brain fog and fatigue, it's got to take a toll on you.
Exactly. Imagine being a kid and having all these aches and pains and not being able to think clearly. It's bound to affect your mood and how you feel about yourself.
Absolutely. And what about kids who are already struggling with mental health issues before getting COVID?
Well, it could make things even worse. And it's not just the kids who are affected, right? It impacts families, schools, communities. We need to make sure these kids are getting the mental health support they need.
It's like this whole long COVID situation is shining a light on how interconnected everything is.
It really is.
Yeah.
We need to start thinking about healthcare in a more holistic way, addressing both the physical and mental aspects of well-being.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit. I was struck by Baumgartner's descriptions of those diseases that are practically eradicated now. Like diphtheria. Did you know it used to be a leading cause of death in children?
It's hard to believe now,
Yeah.
right? But before the vaccine was widely available, diphtheria was a nightmare for parents. The bacteria release this toxin that basically creates this thick coating in the back of the throat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it made it incredibly difficult to breathe. And in really severe cases, it could damage the heart and the nervous system.
That's terrifying.
It was. Kids were especially vulnerable. Outbreaks would just sweep through communities.
Thankfully, the vaccine has made a huge difference.
It has. But it's important to remember that diphtheria hasn't completely disappeared. It's still out there.
So the vaccines are still doing their job, keeping those diseases at bay.
Exactly. And Baumgartner also talks about tetanus. It's caused by bacteria that are found in soil.
I remember learning about that in school, the whole lockjaw thing.
Yeah, tetanus is a nasty one. The bacteria produce this toxin that attacks the nervous system. It causes these really painful muscle spasms, so bad they can even break bones.
Oh, wow. I had no idea it was that serious.
Yeah, it can be really dangerous, especially if it affects the muscles you need for swallowing and breathing.
Thank goodness for the tetanus vaccine.
Right? It's another great example of how vaccines have changed our lives for the better. And then there's mumps. A lot of people think of it as a pretty mild childhood illness.
Yeah, I always thought of it as just a little swelling in the cheeks.
Well, it can be mild, but it can also cause serious complications, especially in adults.
Like what?
Well, for men, mumps can cause inflammation of the testicles, which can sometimes lead to infertility. It can also cause inflammation of the brain.
Yikes. So it's not something to take lightly?
Definitely not. It's another reminder that even those seemingly mild diseases can have some pretty serious consequences.
So what about rubella? I know that one can be dangerous for pregnant women.
Yeah. Rubella, or German measles, is particularly dangerous for pregnant women. If a woman gets infected during pregnancy, especially early on, it can cause some serious birth defects in your baby.
It's a reminder of how important herd immunity is. When enough people are vaccinated, it protects those who can't get vaccinated.
Exactly. It's about protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. So it's like we've come so far in fighting these diseases that we can't get complacent.
We have to remember the lessons of the past. And that brings us back to long COVID, right?
Right. It's a new challenge, but we can approach it with the same spirit of innovation and collaboration that helped us overcome those other diseases.
And that's where Murdoch's recommendations come in. He's not just pointing out the problem, he's giving us a roadmap for how to protect kids from the long-term effects of COVID.
Yeah, he's talking about things we can do as individuals. Vaccinations, masking, improving ventilation, and things we need to change as a society, policies that support families and protect children's health.
It's about recognizing that the health of our children is not just a personal matter, but a collective responsibility.
And it's about remembering the lessons we've learned from those past struggles. We can use that knowledge to guide our actions today and create a healthier future for all children.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from long COVID to the history of those almost forgotten diseases. And as we wrap up this part of our discussion, I'm struck by the importance of critical thinking.
Me too. In this age of information overload, it's crucial to be able to sift through all the noise and figure out what's reliable and what's not.
Especially when it comes to making decisions about our health and the health of our kids.
Absolutely.
Right.
And while it can feel overwhelming, remember that you don't have to do this alone. There are experts out there, doctors, scientists, researchers, who are dedicated to understanding these complex issues.
So if you're feeling lost or confused, don't hesitate to reach out to those trusted sources.
And keep asking questions. The more we learn, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions and protect the health of our children.
Well said. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the world of long COVID and the lessons we can learn from the past. It's really mind-blowing when you think about it. Measles, polio, diphtheria, these diseases that used to be so feared, now they're practically unheard of.
It's amazing, isn't it? The power of human ingenuity. We were facing these massive health challenges, and we managed to overcome them through science and, by working together.
It makes you think, maybe we can do the same with long COVID. It's a tough one for sure, but it's not like we're starting from zero. We've learned so much.
Exactly. And Baumgartner's article really drives home the point that, remembering those past struggles, it's not just about, patting ourselves on the back for how far we've come. It's also a reminder that progress isn't guaranteed. We have to stay vigilant, keep asking questions, be ready to adapt.
And that's where Murdoch's recommendations come in, right? He's not just talking about the problem, he's actually offering solutions, things we can do to protect kids.
Right. He's got this multi-pronged approach. It starts with those individual actions we can all take, like vaccinations, masking, making sure there's good ventilation.
He even talks about thinking about indoor air quality the same way we think about food safety.
Yeah. It's like We wouldn't eat at a restaurant that was, filthy. So why should we accept bad air quality in schools and other places where kids spend so much time?
It makes you wonder why it took us so long to start thinking about this.
I know, right? But at least we're moving in the right direction. People are starting to pay attention to clean air, not just because of COVID, but because it's just like good for everyone's health.
And Murdoch doesn't stop there. He also talks about bigger changes, like policy changes, things like paid sick leave and getting rid of that attendance-based school funding.
Those are really important pieces of the puzzle because at the end of the day, protecting children's health, it's not just a personal thing, it's a societal thing.
It's about creating a world where we value kids' health as much as we value their education and, their future in general.
Exactly. And that brings me to one final thought I want to share, something that's been on my mind a lot throughout this whole deep dive. And it's this. We live in a world that's so obsessed with what's new, what's next, instant results. But sometimes the most important thing is to remember the power of patience and, thinking long term.
Especially with something like long COVID, where we're still trying to figure things out.
Exactly. We might not have all the answers right now, but that's okay. We just have to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep taking action, even if it's just small steps.
It's about trusting the process and believing that we can make a difference.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone to stay curious, keep learning, and never underestimate the power you have to make a positive impact.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this journey into the world of long COVID in kids and what we can learn from the past. We hope you found it informative and, maybe even inspiring.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
We'll see you next time.